30 entries, 7 levels. This is an iceberg of some of the most fascinating yet lost locations on this planet. These are places that were once full of life but could not manage to stand the test of time. We'll start with places that are still remembered and eventually descend into the ones that were never meant to be found. Let's begin at the top. Level 1. Area 51. Area 51 has been the subject of public ire for longer than anyone remembers. Pop culture has elevated the location's significance to such an extent that it even prompted a global meme movement encouraging civilians to raid the highly protected area. The raid was known as Storm Area 51, and it occurred in September of 2019. As far as meme culture and trash posting is concerned, the Storm Area 51 event wasn't exactly too detrimental or serious. It's the extreme secrecy surrounding Area 51 that triggered such a public response in the first place. For decades, the place has been under close scrutiny by the public. What, on the outside, looks like a highly secure military facility for weapon and aircraft testing site has some pretty shady origins and past that are not made to the public by its officials. Area 51 is located in the southern point of Nevada, around 120 kilometers from Los Angeles. According to officials, the site itself is pretty small, but has a massive square area because of the type of testing performed there, those being highly classified weapons and aircrafts. The term Area 51 has no set origins, but it's believed that the location is only known by that name in civilian and conspiracy theory circles. It's officially called the Nevada Test and Training Range by the USAF. However, despite the consistent efforts to mitigate all sorts of rumors and conspiracy theories surrounding the location, Area 51 is allegedly known for some pretty suspicious activities. The extremely tight security surrounding the area naturally just doubles down on its questionable status. The intense form of surveillance surrounding it ranges from guards patrolling the area to various explicit signs that state there will be use of deadly force in case of trespassing. The site has been a hotspot for various non-human activity, including multiple UFO sightings. Now, some people argue that these UFOs are not necessarily alien activity and can simply be considered, well, unidentified flying objects. But there have been multiple ex-workers at the facility who have come out and claimed they've worked on extraterrestrial technology, including studying real alien bodies. This rumor got the ball rolling, and Area 51 ended up becoming one of the most covered mythological phenomena in pop culture. Movies and shows like Independence Day, Doctor Who, and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. actively worked towards strengthening the location's mysterious and haunting nature. Oil rigs in Los Angeles. There's a reason oil, or more scientifically petroleum, is known as black gold in certain industrial circles. It's one of the most profitable and easily accessible natural resources ever, and can even be drilled out in your own backyard. Unfortunately, nothing in this world comes free, especially when it comes to exhaustible resources like petroleum. They're highly detrimental to the natural environment and are the primary reason for the devastatingly irreversible climate issues we have today. When Los Angeles saw its first spark of industrial development in the form of oil discovered by Edward Doney, it had no idea what was coming. From the 1890s to the early 1900s, LA experienced immense economic growth as massive reserves of black gold were uncovered, hidden in plain sight. There was a time in LA's history when oil drilling was so pervasive that people claimed the derricks looked like trees in a forest. That's how densely packed they were. Fortunately, after a few decades of highly profitable yet disastrous environmental impact, government laws and industry regulations were put in place to limit oil drilling as much as economically possible. But oil tycoons weren't about to let that stop them. Instead, they found loopholes in these regulations. They began camouflaging their drilling operations, hiding derricks inside massive, unassuming buildings, offices, malls, religious towers, your neighbors, and even outwardly noble institutions like schools tied to hospitals and charities. One of the prime examples was the Beverly Hills High oil well, also known as the Tower of Hope, an oil rig disguised as a school with flowers painted on it by hospitalized children. It stood right in the middle of LA and was a pretty sight, until you realized what it really was. Eventually, more of these started popping up, and oil tycoons went as far as creating artificial islands off the coast of Long Beach. They looked aesthetically pleasing enough, but make no mistake, these were full-fledged drilling sites. Even now, LA still has plenty of these hidden oil wells in operation, and despite the absolute risk they pose to their surroundings, they show no signs of stopping. Wonderland Amusement Park. China's attempt at its own version of Disneyland failed when construction issues and financial inconsistencies arose during development. Unfortunately, these problems surfaced way too late in the process. The amusement park, known as Wonderland, was already more than halfway built when it was abandoned, leaving behind a cluster of gorgeous, medieval-looking structures with a rich history, but no one to appreciate them. The project began in the late 90s and remained abandoned for years. Located in China's Changzhuang village in the Chongqing district, it was eventually reclaimed by local farmers. They grew crops and raised livestock around the unfinished buildings, structures that stood as nothing more than the remnants of an idea that never reached completion. Over time, the abandoned park became the center of countless paranormal rumors. Some claimed it was built on an old graveyard. Others believed the site was haunted by ghosts who refused to let their resting places be disturbed. Of course, none of these rumors were true. The real reason for the park's downfall was simply a lack of resources from the company that had taken on such a massive project. The contrast between Wonderland's grand abandoned structures and the farmlands surrounding them evoked a strange sense of nostalgia for anyone who saw it. But ultimately, in 2013, what remained of the park was demolished, replaced by a shopping mall, a sad end to an equally sad beginning. Oak Ridge. Area 51 is a blatantly secret location that almost everyone in the world knows about. But some military-inclined locations, for obvious reasons, have been built under even stricter secrecy. And for everyone now very familiar with Oppenheimer and his contributions to the Manhattan Project, there's one little detail that makes the gravity of said project even greater. The Manhattan Project was a multi-location operation spanning different areas. However, most of its material development was carried out in a place known as Oak Ridge, or as it was more ominously called, the Secret City. In 1942, the U.S. military and government forcibly took over 60,000 acres of land in eastern Tennessee to build this hidden facility. They needed a secure location for uranium enrichment for the atomic bomb and settled on Oak Ridge. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers were relocated there, sworn to secrecy and placed under strict surveillance. Guard towers, barbed wire, and military enforcement ensured that the project remained completely hidden from the outside world. Even locals had no idea that their work would eventually lead to the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. After the war, Oak Ridge's existence and purpose were finally revealed to the public. Its control and management were shifted to civilian authorities under the Atomic Commission, which also confirms the fact that the place is still a major nuclear research facility, with dual plants still actively working for more research breakthroughs in nuclear power. Regardless of its status today, no one can deny Oak Ridge's complicated legacy. While it was instrumental in ending World War II, it also forced the world into a nuclear age no one predicted, with all its consequences. Many of its original nuclear plants have since been decommissioned, but the city remains just as active as ever. Level 2. Nicosia International Airport. There's something so inherently desolate about a place that was once bustling with life but had to be shut down due to unfortunate circumstances. That sense of grimness only deepens when those circumstances are tied, whether directly or indirectly, to war. Nicosia International Airport, located in the capital city of Cyprus, was once a thriving hub of commercial travel before it was abandoned in 1977. It was initially used by American bombers in World War II to return from Romania, but was eventually turned into a fully functioning commercial airport. It provided regular flights through a plethora of different international airlines and stayed active from 1948 to 1977. Unfortunately, World War II was not the last of wars this airport had to see. In 1974, just as the airport was about to be expanded into a much larger commercial airport, Cyprus' political framework was completely disrupted. Its president was overthrown, and the country, consequently, this Nicosia airport, was shut down for a few days. However, those few days marked the end of the airport, as just a week later the country was invaded by Turkey. The airport essentially became an active war zone. It was heavily bombed, with both sides deploying a large number of their troops for active warfare right in the middle of it. The conflict made the airport fully inoperable, and soon after, the United Nations took control of it. This marked the beginning of a years-long negotiation to open the airport under joint Cypriot-Turkish agreements. But each and every one of these agreements fell through badly. By 1977, the airport was permanently shut down, its final commercial flight marking the end of its service. The haunting images of the airport we see on the internet today are definitely not for the weak. From the rotting plane bodies and unmanned reception chambers to the actual symptoms of war seen all around the area, it's no doubt the now abandoned airport has a history of witnessing some very tough battles. City Methodist Church. Ancient European or English ruins have long been the subject of public delight. Massive structures like the Colosseum have been tourist attractions for centuries and continue to be maintained simply for what they are. However, what of modern ruins, places that weren't built too long ago but were abandoned simply because the world moved on without them? The City Methodist Church in Gary, Indiana is the primary example of a place built to remain but could not escape its tragic fate of being abandoned. It was built in 1926 and was once a grand display of Gothic revival architecture. It was basically erected as a testimony to how blessed the thriving steel city of Gary, Indiana was. But soon, it became too much for the economy and the local government to handle, which is a great shame considering how intricate the infrastructure of the building was. It was grand and had towering stained glass windows and intricate stone carvings that made it just as beautiful as any olden church. But as the steel industry declined, so did the city. The once booming population dwindled, and by 1975, the church's congregation had shrunk to almost nothing. With maintenance costs soaring and no funds to keep it running, City Methodist Church was abandoned. While that has given it a vintage edge with vines draped over its walls and almost deliberately aesthetic cracks, the structure itself is dangerously unstable. Decades of neglect have left the church completely unsalvageable. It's unfortunately also a major asbestos site, making restoration both hazardous and financially demanding. Over the years, the church has become a hotspot for urban explorers, photographers, and even Hollywood filmmakers looking for the perfect post-apocalyptic backdrop. Despite multiple plans to either restore or demolish it, the church remains in its hauntingly beautiful state, a relic of time when Gary, Indiana stood tall. Sanji UFO houses. There are old abandoned churches based off of Victorian Gothic architecture. Then there are structures that are taken straight out from the future. The Sanji UFO houses in New Taipei, Taiwan are an eerie collection of pod-shaped homes. They were supposed to be a luxurious seaside resort for American soldiers initially, but like most of these projects, it lost its funding very early on. The Sanji UFO houses were supposed to be a vision of modern architecture designed to attract wealthy vacationers. Instead, the project was abandoned before completion, leaving behind a landscape of decaying, retro-futuristic structures that fully feel like they belong in a dystopian movie. The construction of these structures began in 1978 with the goal of creating a high-end retreat inspired by sci-fi aesthetics. Hence the pod/UFO-shaped apartments stacked on top of one another. Despite the unique idea, the progress for the project never came. A series of financial problems and very bizarre accidents overtook the site, and the entire thing was shut before it managed to attract even one single customer. The bizarre accidents ranged from random car crashes in the area to workers reportedly suffering unexplained workplace deaths, including suicide. Some even believed the land was cursed, either due to it being built over an old Dutch burial ground or because of a dragon statue that was decapitated during construction. By 1980, the project was completely abandoned. Over the years, the UFO houses stood empty. They were extremely rusty and naturally got battered by time. They ultimately became a magnet for urban legends, explorers, and photographers fascinated by their eerie, otherworldly look. Despite efforts to preserve them as a cultural landmark, the decaying pods were ultimately demolished in 2010, completely being erased from Taiwan's rich history. Level 3. Kayakyo. There's just something utterly tragic about an abandoned town with an insanely rich history, especially one that wasn't just left behind, but was forced to be abandoned because of political conflict. We've already seen a number of ruins that have deteriorated simply because of natural disasters and war, but Kayakyo is a ghost town with an exceptionally sad history. It's located in the hills of the southwestern Turkey province known as Muğla. It was once a vibrant multicultural town that housed both Muslims and Christians. For as far as history can tell, both groups lived there in complete harmony and were actively involved with each other's rituals and festivals without any conflict. The town's sturdy ruins clearly show that the people there were great artisans with a knack for building and decorating. Unfortunately, the Greco-Turkish War in 1919 changed everything for the residents of Kayakyo. After Turkey had won the war and the agreement of population exchange was confirmed, there were mass deportations taking place in both countries. This resulted in 1.5 million people being forcibly displaced from their ancestral homes, including the entire Greek population of Kayakyo. Those who left were never allowed to return, and the Turkish Muslims who were supposed to replace them never fully settled in. According to certain rumors, the town had a notoriety for housing Greek ghosts that wouldn't let other people settle in their ancestral homes. Over time, Kayakyo simply withered away under complete isolation. By 2022, it only had around 900 residents, all of them being in the peripheries rather than the dense housing area. The town's beautifully abandoned ruins are basically another haunting reminder of the consequences of war. With its plethora of gorgeously crafted homes and roofless churches, Kayakyo is unfortunately now only a ghostly open-air museum, and sadly looks the part too. Albania bunkers. Like every war, the Cold War came with its own set of consequences, many of which can still be seen around the world. However, not every country affected by the war looks at its repercussions with disdain. One such example can be seen in the form of the biggest projects undertaken by Albania during this time. It was the construction of its infamous bunkers, all thanks to its communist leader, Enver Hoxha. The program, known as the Bunkerization of Albania, was a nationwide building project fueled by Hoxha's paranoia. His government was known for its hostility toward the outside world, and he was so convinced that Albania would be attacked that he isolated the country completely, even from its allies. Eventually, his fears escalated to the point where he launched a massive fortification effort, one that not only crippled the nation's economy, but also set the stage for his own downfall. Hoxha's totalitarian rule didn't exactly win him any favors with the international community, and his paranoia only made things worse. He was determined to defend Albania from a threat that never came, which is why he ordered the construction of hundreds of thousands of bunkers across the country. Estimates suggest there are anywhere between 170,000 to 750,000 of them. Unsurprisingly, this over-the-top project only made things worse for Albania. The economy of the country that was already struggling took a severe hit. The cost of these bunkers drained 80% of the country's military resources. To put that into perspective, just one bunker could have funded a 2-bedroom apartment easily. On top of that, the construction process was grueling, with harsh working conditions that even led to worker deaths. Ultimately, since there was never an actual need for fortification, these countless thick iron and steel bunkers were left abandoned. And now Albania has them scattered all over the country for absolutely no reason whatsoever. The upside is, they're now a part of Albania's history, and the people have embraced that. Some of these bunkers have been repurposed as houses, tourist attractions, restaurants, and even museums. They've become national symbols, and you can even find bunker-themed souvenirs for tourists. The door to hell. There are a lot of naturally occurring phenomena that completely baffle the likes of scientists. Aurora borealis, bioluminescence, fire rainbows, and bloodfall are some that can be named. However, this man-made/natural phenomenon in Turkmenistan is one of the most bizarre things that, to this day, have no confirmed origins. The Door to Hell is a repeatedly burning crater located in Karakum Desert, Turkmenistan, and it's exactly how you'd imagine it to be. This monstrosity of a site consists of a massive hole in the ground surrounded by walls on fire. While this does sound like something straight out of a sci-fi horror movie, the Door to Hell, also known as Darvaza Gas Crater, is as real and as creepy as it can get. There is no sure way to know how the crater was created. There are multiple theories revolving around it. One of the most popular ones suggests that it was the result of a Soviet experiment gone wrong. A drilling operation allegedly accidentally collapsed into an underground gas cavern. To prevent poisonous gases from spreading out to the locality, scientists set the entire area on fire. Though how they did it remains a complete mystery. But some locals also iterate that even the Soviet scientists weren't able to predict how long the crater would continue to burn. The crater first emerged in 1980 and has been burning ever since. It is now a massive tourist attraction in Turkmenistan, and people from all over the world come over just to witness this bizarre sight. Unfortunately, there have been multiple discussions within the Turkmenistan government about permanently sealing off the crater. While that hasn't happened yet, there's a chance the fire might die down on its own. Regular visitors have reported that the flames don't burn as brightly as they once did. Houtuan. Houtuan is a fishing village on the east of Shanghai that is arguably one of the most hauntingly beautiful ghost towns in the country. The village was once a thriving fishing community that was left abandoned in the 1980s because of its remoteness. It now stands as an eerie ghost town with its huts completely covered by creeping green vines. The village was once a fairly massive settlement that housed over 3,000 residents. It had always been extremely scenic and was a thriving community. However, despite its beautiful views and fishing waters, the village's exceptionally remote location eventually became its downfall. By the 1990s, most of its residents had moved on to the mainland for better job and education opportunities. It had a significant lack of modern infrastructure and medical facilities that made its residents' lives increasingly difficult. This eventually forced families to abandon their homes. By 2002, the village was completely uninhabited. Since there were no humans left to look after the location, nature eventually took over. Today, Houtuan looks like something straight out of a post-apocalyptic or fantasy film. Its entire commercial area is blanketed in thick green foliage that almost makes it look like a fairy settlement. Despite being abandoned, Houtuan has also gained a second life as a tourist attraction. People from all over the world now visit the area to capture its eerie beauty. This has also pushed local authorities to start promoting it as a sightseeing spot. Level 4. The Old Diplomat Hotel. The Old Diplomat Hotel was a structure in the Philippines that couldn't shake off its dark and unforgiving past. This eventually led to its downfall, and it started to gain notoriety for being one of the most haunted places on Earth. The Old Diplomat Hotel on top of the Dominican Hill in Baguio City was once a vacation spot for American friars. They acquired the spot way back in 1911 and built a resort on top for the perfect casual retreat. Everything was as peachy as it sounds until World War II hit. During that time, the hotel was used as a sanctuary to provide protection from people fleeing from Japanese forces. Ultimately, once the Japanese got a whiff of the location, they took over. They turned it into one of their own outposts and exercised complete control over the area. What followed was a period of and mass executions, with many priests, nuns, and civilians reportedly meeting horrible fates in the property. The world now believes that these very spirits haunt the vicinity and are forever trapped in the place where they were mercilessly killed. The location was eventually acquired by Diplomat Hotels in the 1970s. It was repurposed and remodeled entirely to fit hotel standards. While it remained operational for years after the renovation, its past never seemed to fade. Staff and guests reported multiple encounters with the paranormal, claiming they witnessed whispering, crying, screaming, and headless bodies moving around the hallways. After the then-owner's death in 1986, the Diplomat Hotel finally became defunct. Despite the government's multiple attempts at restoring it, the hotel remains abandoned to this day. It is, however, a very popular spot for ghost hunters and urban explorers. Bangar Fort. If a locality's government is asking people to stay away from that area, you best believe there's something wrong with it. The Bangar Fort, located in the Rajasthan state of India, is one such location. It was built by the 23rd Raja of Amber, Bhangwat Das, for his son Madho Singh, and is known for its stunning architecture despite being a product of the 16th century. Bangar Fort, however, is not known for its royal history as much as it's known for its infamous curse. According to legends, anyone who stays in the area after sundown is bound to face ill fate. There are different origins of the curse, but the main story behind it can be attributed to a Hindu ascetic who warned the makers of the fort to cease their construction. He claimed that if any of the fort's structure ended up being larger than his own house, the entire village would face nature's wrath, which is precisely what happened when the fort columns were erected. The entire area was devastated by some sort of natural disaster. In other accounts, the story goes something like, a sorcerer fell in love with one of the fort's princesses and tried to bewitch her with black magic. Unfortunately, the plan backfired and the sorcerer ended up cursing Bangar before his death. He doomed it to eternal desolation. Soon after, the fort was destroyed in an invasion, and no one was left to lift the curse. Regardless of what the story behind the curse was, locals definitely do not take Bangar Fort easily. There's been multiple reports of not only strange occurrences and encounters in the area, but also of very coincidental accidents. Most of these accidents have ended up with deaths of at least one party involved. Locals refuse to stay after sunset, claiming that anyone who does never returns. The Archaeological Survey of India has even put up signs strictly prohibiting entry after sundown. Murni Mine. Murni Mine is one of the largest man-made holes on the planet. It's a massive open-pit diamond mine that sits in the middle of eastern Serbia. It's about 1,200 meters wide and 525 meters deep, and is apparently so deep that helicopters aren't allowed to fly over it because of airflow. The mine was discovered in 1955 when Soviet geologists were searching for diamonds to compete with the West. Murni was producing millions of carats of diamonds per year very soon after. It quickly became one of the most valuable mines in the world. However, the actual mining part was no easy task. Winters in Serbia were brutal. They were messing up basic operations. The machinery would freeze and workers would have to use jet engines and dynamite to break through the frozen ground. The open pit mine shut down in 2001 after being nearly exhausted of its diamonds. Its underground operations continued until 2017, though, until a devastating flood forced it to close completely. Today, Murni Mine is nothing more than a massive abandoned crater in the middle of nowhere. It looks as terrifying as it sounds and is just a fascinating example of human ambition. Pastranja. For a country with such a strong geopolitical advantage, Pastranja in Poland unfortunately got the worst of history. Pastranja was a small, scenic cattle town in the 1300s that suffered the brunt of some of the most devastating wars on humanity. Its ruins are located in southwestern Poland, and it now stands as an amalgamation of crumbling buildings, overgrown foliage, and eerie silence. The town's warring history started when it was taken over by German forces in 1939 during World War II. The Nazis used it as a military base because of its highly strategic location, and used it to their own benefit for attacking Polish borders. In 1945, the Germans were driven out and the town was forced under the jurisdiction of the Soviet Union. In fact, its Soviet influence was so great it was beginning to be known as the Little Soviet Union. The Russians turned this town into a blooming military zone. They moved their soldiers along with families and began to use the town's buildings for their own daily operations. At its peak, Pastranja had a massive population of almost 20,000 people. However, the town was exclusively open for only Soviet soldiers and their families. It was off-limits to the locals and was barbed everywhere. It was self-sufficient enough to operate as a miniature Soviet state within Poland's borders. There was another name this little town was known by, which was not nearly as pleasant as any other. It was called the Polish Chernobyl. That is because, while no one exactly knows what went on within the borders of the area, there were rumors that it was on its way to becoming a nuclear base. The Soviets were using this location to store devastating nuclear weapons, the traces of which can still be seen through rocket hangars. When the Soviet Union fell in 1990, every soldier and his family within the town retreated immediately. The town was left behind as an empty shell of its former glory. Since then, the only residents it's managed to attract are thrill seekers and urban explorers. Level 5. Villa Epecuén. Villa Epecuén was once a thriving lakeside resort in Argentina that now stands as a testimony to how unforgiving nature can be. It is located in Argentina's Buenos Aires province and was founded in the early 1920s. The town, and in turn the resort, was once renowned for its interesting location along the shores of Lago Epecuén. Lago Epecuén is a saltwater lake known for its supposed healing properties, and is primarily the reason why the place attracted so many visitors in the first place. It managed to draw thousands of tourists to stay at the resort during its peak years. For decades, the town flourished with hotels, restaurants, and a considerable population that kept everything lively. But in the mid-1980s, a period of heavy rainfall caused Lago Epecuén to overflow. This ended up fracturing the area's dam and causing the entire area to flood like never seen before. Just 2 weeks later, the town was completely submerged under nearly 10 meters of water. What's worse is, the flooding at the time was so bad that the town remained under the water for 25 years. The water made its buildings erode under, and there was basically no trace of it for multiple decades. Eventually, though, the lake water began receding in the early 2000s. What emerged from beneath was nothing short of a landscape straight out of a fantasy movie. The lake's high salinity left everything coated in a ghostly white residue. Everything from the buildings to the trees were wonky and falling apart. The area has remained abandoned ever since. The only known resident of the town is a man known as Pablo Novak. He used to live in Villa Epecuén before it flooded, and now refuses to leave behind the place he once called home. Fordlandia. Fordlandia, a city located on the east banks of Tapajós River of Amazon, was once a utopian-like district meant to mimic the idea of a perfect state. It was bought by the revolutionary industrialist Henry Ford as a practical experiment of his vision of an idealistic city. Henry Ford was looking into ways to get his hands on his own rubber production as an American response to the British monopoly over Sri Lankan rubber trees. He found Brazil's Amazon to be the next best answer, where they had recently located more rubber trees. After negotiations with the Brazilian government, Ford managed to acquire 10,100 square kilometers of land near the Tapajós River. Work began in the area in 1926 but was already facing a lot of setbacks. Because of the remoteness of the location, building materials and basic safety measures were hard to come across. The only real access to the mainland was through the Tapajos River, which in itself was a dangerous feat. In spite of all the problems, local workers managed to make it work, and the city was finally almost thriving by 1928. Unfortunately, things only went downhill after that. While the infrastructure of Fordlandia was very much modern and accommodating, the rules imposed on workers living there were anything but. Ford's managers kept a close eye on everyone. They had strict dietary measures set in place, and alcohol was completely forbidden. Ultimately, this caused the locals to riot against the managers in 1930. They vandalized the entire area and caused a significant amount of monetary loss in terms of repairs. While the rioting crowds were eventually subdued, the damage had already been done. The streak of bad luck for Fordlandia had only just started. The original goal that made Ford get the Brazilian city in the first place was to grow more rubber trees. However, when that push came to shove, the botanists he'd hired realized that the area was prone to parasites and disease. This would make the rubber trees very unlikely to grow there in one piece. So in other words, Ford had to now cut his losses and move on, which his grandson eventually did after World War II and sold Fordlandia to its peripheral areas for a massive net loss. The city remained lifeless and humanless for years afterwards, until it finally managed to gain some attention from the locals. There are now about 3,000 people living there. Centralia. We've clearly noticed a pattern in history when it comes to coal mining incidents. They're very common. In addition to that, they're also very dangerous to not only human life, but also to the environment. Another major coal mining-related accident that stands out for its peculiar nature made a small town in Pennsylvania called Centralia completely shut down. Centralia was a small, quiet coal mining town in Pennsylvania that was hit by one of the oddest coal-related incidents ever. The town was initially fairly well equipped and housed over 2,000 residents, but in 1962, a seemingly innocent fire permanently sealed the town's fate. The alleged story behind the fire states that local firefighters burned some landfill like they'd always done and accidentally set an old abandoned strip mine aflame. Without any instant protective measures, the fire spread out quickly and completely engulfed the underground mining tunnels. People eventually started to notice the gradual rise in temperature and realized something was wrong. But even that happened over the course of a few years, and by then, things had gone too far. By the 1980s, massive sinkholes started appearing randomly in the area. They became so common and hazardous that multiple people were falling victim to it. The final straw for authorities and residents was when a 12-year-old fell into a 150-foot sinkhole, and while the child would go on to survive, the town was marked unsalvageable with all its residents slowly evacuating. In 1992, the state of Pennsylvania used eminent domain to claim what remained of Centralia, officially condemning the town. Most of its buildings were demolished, and today only a few homes and structures remain. The town's zip code was even revoked in 2002, making it, in many ways, a ghost town in every sense. Level 6. Garcia Moreno Prison. Garcia Moreno Prison, built by the twice president of Ecuador in 1869, was one of the most brutal places on this planet. The 300-capacity prison at one time held more than 2,600 people in the facility. This in itself shows you how vicious the place was when it was functional. The 140-year-old prison was deserted when all of its inmates in 2014 were shifted to other facilities around the country. Subsequently, the prison was turned into a museum which became a hotspot for tourists that were familiar with its dark history. One of the most famous cases was the imprisonment of an ex-president and revolutionary leader of Ecuador, General Eloy Alfaro. After a coup d'etat, Alfaro and his supporters were detained. The prison happened to be Garcia Moreno Prison. Later on, he was assassinated in this very prison along with his supporters. His body was removed from his cell and burned. The prison has a history of hostility. The dangers lurking in every corner could be proved by the fact that there were multiple globally popular criminals incarcerated there. The 15-year-old serial killer famous for killing 22 men, Juan Fernando Hermosa, was a prisoner there. Mob leaders, murderers, and even famous politicians had all witnessed the brutality that was the Garcia Moreno prison. With how many powerful people it held within itself, the prison basically had no rule of law. Most of the prisoners were there for a lifetime and had nothing to lose. Assassinations, drug trafficking, and illegal arms dealings were everyday occurrences. Law and order were practically non-existent. Today, Garcia Moreno Prison stands as a chilling reminder of Ecuador's most violent history. Although it doesn't house the world's most dangerous people in its walls anymore, its existence is a testimony to the idea that humans are way more dangerous than some meager ghosts. UTA Flight 772 Memorial. On September 19, 1989, UTA Flight 772 was en route from Brazzaville, Republic of Congo to Paris, France, when tragedy struck. For all the passengers, the flight was a routine one with nothing seeming odd or out of the ordinary. However, in one of the most tragic terrorist attacks in recorded history, Flight 772 never made it to its destination. A bomb planted in the cargo hold by Libyan terrorists exploded 45 minutes into the flight. This caused the aircraft to break apart and crash into the remote Teneri Desert in Niger. All 156 passengers and 14 crew members on board lost their lives. The debris from the crash fell in the middle of nowhere. The harsh conditions of the desert, in addition to dangerous political instability, made it impossible for officials to investigate the site. It wasn't until 2007 when a memorial was finally built. The families of the victims came together to create a memorial in the very place the plane had crashed. But it wasn't easy. They had to travel miles with a massive security team to reach the area just to get a glimpse of their loved ones' last moments. They used debris from the wreckage along with black volcanic stones to build a massive 200-foot diameter circle surrounding the aircraft's semi-visible wing. The wing was placed at the center of the circle in a way that it points towards France, a testimony to what could have been. Broken mirrors were arranged along the perimeter of the circle to represent the number of lives lost in the explosion. The memorial is big enough to be visible even from satellite images. It serves as a haunting tribute to those who perished. Unfortunately, while memorials are meant to be commemorative, the UTA Flight 772 site remains in complete isolation. The Manila Film Center. The Manila Film Center was a film theater built in 1981 in the Philippines. It was meant to act as Asia's very own Cannes Palais, but only managed to make its mark on history for the wrong reasons. The then First Lady of the country, Imelda Marcos, was a beauty pageant winner who had a knack for theater. Driven by her own interest, she took on the responsibility to arrange a film festival and ordered the construction of a film theater, both designed to rival the prestige of Cannes. The Manila Film Festival was scheduled to be held in January of 1982, and the construction of the film center began 3 months prior. With only 77 days on hand, the construction workers were not only being overworked, they were being rushed to the core. These poor people were pushed to their limits to complete the structure. Naturally, tragedy struck. Just a month into it, a scaffolding collapsed on the scene. 169 construction workers working at the time fell to their deaths into quick-drying cement. What's worse was how the top brass dealt with the horrific accident. Instead of instantly sending help to the site, they blocked all rescue workers and ambulances from entering the scene. Reports claim that the site was completely inaccessible for at least 9 hours. Unfortunately, construction continued, and the film festival was eventually held in the very area that now entombed more than 100 workers, or so it's reported. The The Manila Film Center remained abandoned over the years. The final nail in its coffin was the 1990 earthquake, which shattered its structure. And while there have been multiple efforts to revive the theater, maybe something with a history this dark remains to be in the shadows. Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. Nuclear plant explosions and radioactive contamination were once the stuff of science fiction until they became reality. In April of 1986, the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine exploded into smithereens. The result was so devastating that the world continues to feel its consequences to this day. In what seemed like a routine safety test for the reactor, the massively underqualified workers made a mistake. Ironically, the workers there were trying to simulate the reactor's behavior in the unlikely case of a blackout. Instead, they made an error that caused the reactor and its uranium fuel to overheat, further causing the containment to melt. The instantaneous explosion succeeding the melting released numerous radioactive materials into the atmosphere. The contamination was so bad that its effects could be felt all the way to Europe. Apparently, about 100,000 square kilometers of land was contaminated, which included Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and some parts of Europe. The immediate result of the explosion was devastating. Both leading engineers on the safety team instantly lost their lives. And over the course of the next few months, 28 workers present at the scene also died from acute radiation syndrome. The community around the reactor was instantly evacuated. A 30-kilometer exclusion zone was created around the affected site, and the evacuated were assured they would come back after 36 hours. Unfortunately, the contamination was too much and could not be contained. The radiation levels made the area uninhabitable and turned not only the affected site, but the entire city of Pripyat into a frozen time capsule of Soviet life. The area looks as eerie and ghost-like now as it did years ago. You can see abandoned schools with dusty textbooks randomly sitting. You can also see the post-apocalyptic horror of the empty Ferris wheel in Pripyat amusement park. The entire city impresses this sense of overwhelming stillness and doom. While some areas have been opened for guided tours, radiation hotspots still exist. The previously decaying sarcophagus of the affected reactor has now been fortified with a new safe confinement that does a great job of keeping the area safe. Level 7. Hashima Island. Japan's rapid industrialization in the 1940s has been immortalized in a lot of examples. One of the biggest ones is Hashima Island, also known as Gunkanjima or Battleship Island, existing off the coast of Nagasaki. It's called Battleship Island because of its very mechanical fortress-like appearance and lack of surrounding flora. Unfortunately, the history behind Hashima doesn't only hint at the rapid development phase, it also stands as a relic to Japan's very dark wartime history. The island was originally discovered in the late 1800s and was quickly recognized for its huge coal deposits. It was the multinational automobile corporation Mitsubishi that developed it into a major coal mining site. The corporation eventually managed to turn it into a fully functional community with a considerable population. At its peak in the 1950s, Hashima was home to over 5,000 people. It was considered one of the most densely populated places on Earth. However, this is where things start to take a slightly darker turn. The coal miners and laborers living on the island were war prisoners that lived under harrowing conditions. They were forced to work and live in cramped concrete buildings and had to endure life-threatening conditions. Naturally, there were a lot of lives lost on the island due to said circumstances. Eventually, though, as Japan shifted from coal to petroleum in the 1970s, the island's mines became obsolete. In 1974, Mitsubishi shut down operations and Hashima was abandoned almost overnight. And that basically marked the end of a very dark beginning. Now, after decades of remaining abandoned, the island and its building have taken a dystopian, post-apocalyptic appearance. It's also managed to draw a lot of global attention. The Japanese government opened it up for limited tourism in 2009, and in 2015 it was marked as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, though not without controversy. The war crimes committed on the island continue to haunt it despite its significance in Japanese history. Poveglia Island. To fully get the idea of how dangerous a particular location is, getting information about the area from locals is probably your best bet. If the locals avoid that place like the plague, know that it's not something one should be messing with. Poveglia is a small island located between Venice and Lido, known for being one of the most haunted places on this earth. Its history isn't the most decorated. In fact, the tragedies it has seen in its existence somehow consolidate its reputation as a haunted place. It was used as a quarantine site when Italy was hit by the Great Plague of Milan in the early 1600s. Most of the infected and dead from Venice were transported to the island, and were subsequently locked there until their inevitable death. When enough plague victims would lose their lives, the plague doctors would dig large pits on the island. All the dead bodies would be thrown in those massive pits and would eventually be burnt or closed off. The number of deaths on the island was estimated to have reached around 100,000. Locals claim that the island is 50% dirt and 50% human ashes. Unfortunately, the island's dark fate didn't end there. In 1922, Poveglia was re-inhabited by a large number of psychiatric patients. The doctor in charge of these patients was known for being a brutal and violent person who used all sorts of immoral and downright disturbing procedures on his patients. In fact, the hospital was more of a torture chamber than a rehab center. There's a lot more unconfirmed history surrounding the utterly horrible and spine-chilling practices done on the island in that era. It's believed that the cruel head doctor had eventually thrown himself off the hospital clock tower because he was haunted by his victims. Today, the island is completely off limits to everyone. It has its own government that keeps a very close watch on it and has closed it off to the general public. If there's anyone who wants to go explore, they have to apply for a permit years before to even have a remote chance. The fishermen and locals in the area also avoid it as much as they can. They claim to see vengeful spirits roaming the island, waiting for the day to pass on. Paris Catacombs. One of the most macabre instances of Gothic architecture in history are the Paris Catacombs. They're an eerie underground ossuary that holds the remains of over 6 million Parisians. For those wondering why something so harrowing would even exist in the world, it's actually for a surprisingly practical but disgusting reason. The Paris Catacombs were basically the answer to two of the biggest problems Paris was facing in the 18th century. One, the extremely hazardous sinkholes that were randomly appearing within the city, and two, the increasingly disgusting fumes and toxins from the city's open mass grave. Paris was continually expanding in the 18th century, but with all that expansion came a few unforeseen problems that were becoming increasingly dangerous. The entire city was, and still is, built over massive old mines. These mines were, well, old, which makes them highly dangerous and prone to collapsing. When they finally did, in the form of sinkholes, people would be taken off guard. Without any current-day modern technology, these collapses weren't only ruining the city's framework, but were also taking multiple lives. On the other hand, Paris also had horrendous sanitation conditions that were becoming more fatal to the general public by the hour. The trend for burial in that area was extremely odd. Everyone who died in the city would be buried in mass open graves that would only be closed once they were filled to the brim. To make things worse, these cemeteries were overcrowded and the bodies in them were constantly decomposing. It wasn't long before the fumes from these decomposing bodies began to make residents extremely unwell. People reported to be suffering from not only nausea and vomiting, but also delirium. Eventually, in the late 1780s, efforts to shift the remains of the deceased from the cemeteries to the mines in order to strengthen them began. All of these remains were arranged in a hauntingly symmetrical way inside the mine shafts, donning the entire thing in an absolutely diabolical vibe. After the French Revolution came, these catacombs began to fill up more, and before anyone knew it, there were more than 6 million bodies displayed within. While the ossuary did solve Paris's life-threatening problems, it also brought a strange notoriety to the city. Now that these catacombs are open to the public, one can see how truly dark and haunting they are. Island of Dolls. Despite how fake and shammy they sound, superstitions, myths, and legends do regrettably have some sort of truth to them. The Island of Dolls, located in Mexico City, is perhaps one example that takes this concept a bit too far. It's located in the Xochimilco borough, a few miles from the center of Mexico City, and is known for being a hotspot for dark tourism. The island offers precisely what it advertises in its name. It's literally an island stocked with creepy-looking, decaying dolls scattered all around it. The Island of Dolls, or La Islas de las Muñecas, was owned by a man who had his entire life changed by one horrific yet tragic incident, or so he claimed. Don Julian Santana Barrera was a superstitious man who believed he had encountered the spirit of a girl who had drowned in the waters surrounding the island. He was thoroughly convinced the girl was haunting the island, with his suspicions only becoming stronger when he found a doll floating near the girl's body. He believed the only way to stop her was to litter the island with dolls as a form of respect. He hoped doing this would honor the deceased and let them pass to the other side with ease. Now, there are mixed opinions about this story. Don's own family claims that there's a big chance he made this story up himself. He was a recluse who left his wife and children to live on the island alone and had been doing so for years. Whether the story of him being possessed or haunted by the girl was true or not, there was something off about his behavior. His family wasn't happy with how he was turning out and claimed he had changed for the worse. Sadly, his fixation went too far and he lost his life in the same eerie way the girl had, by drowning. After Barrera's death, the island was open to the public. It instantly gained a lot of attention and even managed to get a Guinness World Record for the world's largest collection of haunted dolls. The island is still a sensitive topic with the locals. Some of them believe that the area, and in turn the dolls, are completely haunted. Some have even claimed to see them change expressions, move, and whisper to each other.